Thanks for joining us today for today's webinar, Mental Health and Young Athletes, Stress, Eating Disorders, and More. I'm Greg Berry, Director of Communications in the Office of Alumni Affairs. Since this is a virtual event, please excuse any technical issues that may pop up. If you experience problems with your video or audio, click the reconnect button at the top of your screen to get back to the webinar right away. A quick note, this webinar is being recorded. A replay of it will be made available on our website by tomorrow. Also, I have a question for today's guest. Drop it in the chat. We'll have time for Q&A before we end. Today, we're excited to welcome Dr. Dayna Watson. Dr. Watson is currently an assistant professor of human studies in the UAB School of Education. She completed her PhD in counseling and counselor education from the University of Florida. Dr. Watson has extensive experience and training in clinical supervision and mental health counseling with a specialization in counseling children and young adults. At this time, I would like to welcome Dayna Watson to our webinar series. Dr. Watson, the forum is yours, and thank you so much for spending time with us this afternoon.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. I'm excited to be here to really talk about something that I feel really passionate about, and that is the mental health and well-being of our young ones, and especially today talking some about our athletes. And so my hope is that whether you're attending as a parent who's thinking about your own children, or if you're a professional out in the field working with students, that you'll be able to leave today with some ideas about ways to think about your students' mental health, their well-being, ways to support them, and a few strategies for responding when there could be a problem. And so thank you for that introduction, Greg. Like you said, my background really is in counseling children and adolescents. That's an area where I've spent most of my professional career, looking at especially young children through all the way up through college, young adult, that time frame. And so, like I said, I hope today is really helpful and provide some practical tips as well as some foundational knowledge about what we know about mental health in young people. So like I said, today our goal is that we're going to understand stress and some common mental health issues in student athletes specifically. We're going to look at some specific symptoms or behaviors that could potentially indicate a mental health concern in your student or your student athlete, and then look at some specific steps if you're concerned. And we will be talking about, just kind of giving you a heads up, we will be talking some about self-injury and suicide as well as part of this conversation. And to reiterate, if you have questions, I have some time at the end, please put them in the chat. I see some of your kind hello messages already, and so we will get to those at the end. So let's just start with getting an idea of what we really know from a research perspective about child and adolescent mental health rates. And so I've dropped some CDC data here. There's a lot of data out here, out in the world about mental health and well-being of children and adolescents. And so a few key statistics you see here. First, we're looking at children between the ages of 3 to 17. So that's a wide range of age, right? In their lifetime. So looking at all of these folks, at least one point in their life, just shy of 10% of children meet the criteria for ADHD, just shy of 10% meet the criteria for anxiety, and around 4.5% meet the criteria for depression. This is one kind of a one-time kind of prevalence rate. When we're looking at adolescents specifically, so maybe when we're starting to think a little bit more about when students are getting more into their athletic experiences, especially more structured formal athletic experiences, 15% or so have had a depressive episode in the last year. As many as 37% have experienced notable feelings of sadness or hopelessness. 4% substance use disorder or a problem with substances. And this number may surprise you, but 18%, close to 20% of adolescents between 13 and 17 have considered suicide, and just shy of 10 completing suicide or attempting suicide. And so when you look at these numbers, you see, hey, this can be pretty widespread. It maybe even if this is the first time you've had much experience with statistics related to student mental health, you may be surprised. As most folks agree that these numbers underrepresent the true numbers, that this is underreported. Some folks would suggest that as much as 20% of children or adolescents meet the criteria for a depressive episode in their childhood, which is a little bit higher than this. And so I say all this to just lay the groundwork of, if I'm working with kids, if I have kids in my household, mental health concerns are there. Statistically speaking, they're widespread enough that they're happening. If you're working in a school setting or an after school program and you've got 100 kids, it's pretty safe to assume 10 of them may be dealing with depression or anxiety. And so 10 out of 100, just an estimate to give you a picture of what might be going on. I do want to note here, and it's really outside the scope of today's conversation, but some populations of children and adolescents are at higher risk of mental health concerns. If you know much about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, we know that children and adolescents who experience some adverse childhood experiences like food insecurity, parental unemployment, parental substance abuse issues, community violence, etc., are even more likely to experience negative mental health outcomes. So if you're working at a school or in a setting that's serving a population or a community where there's a high amount of violence and poverty, etc., it may be closer to 20% of your kiddos really experiencing some of these things. And so the issues are out there, they're prevalent. Now we'll get to some good news later. I hate to start on kind of a negative note, but we are here to talk about student needs and how to meet those needs. So that's what we know in general about child and adolescent mental health rates. So what about student athletes? And so what I've found over the past several years is there tends to be an decent amount or kind of some emerging data, specifically looking at college-age student athletes. However, looking at younger students, so middle school, high school age students, we don't have a ton of research really specifically looking at the needs of that population. So we have to make some estimations or some assumptions based on what we know in general about childhood mental health, as well as what we know about older athlete mental health. And so when you're thinking about a child who's involved more formally, especially in athletics, so looking at competitive teams, getting into high school sports, into college sports, those students have all the same kind of usual pressures of childhood and adolescence that everybody has. And then they experience this added layer of stressors or things to grapple with and deal with that students who are not athletes may not be experiencing. So added pressure related to performance on the field or the court, juggling multiple time commitments. If you're a parent to an athlete, then you know how much time you spent going here and there to practices and training and all of those sorts of things. The social impact of sports involvement. So there are pros and cons, I think. A lot of students get a lot of social support and networking and positive benefits from that social involvement with their athletics, but then there's also some trade-offs sometimes to that as well. And then as students get older and move towards college and into college, looking at additional stress related to eligibility, scholarships, etc. There is some research where we've interviewed athletes and especially college athletes and looking at this, and they've said, yeah, there's a lot of stress here. There's a lot of stuff going on that is difficult for me. And so whether we're thinking about just diagnosis of mental health or just the general idea of like, how are these athletes doing overall, we know that they're experiencing high levels of stress, some burnout, they've got some stuff going on, some things that we really need to be able to attend to. So what does the research say about college athletes? So if we're going to use some of this data to help us understand athletes across the lifespan, like I said, there is some data out there about student athlete mental health. Obviously, anytime we're talking about mental health and wellness in the last decade, we have that kind of COVID impact there in the middle in the last few years. And so the research essentially says that between 2011 and 2019, college athletes actually had a slightly lower rates of diagnosis compared to their non-athlete peers. The exception to this was in three areas. That's suicide rates, rates of substance abuse, and rates of eating disorders. I think we should be careful with this data a little bit. I think it reflects some truth, but I also, based on what I've known in interviewing athletes and trainers and et cetera, I think there's probably some underreporting here as well. Folks worry about eligibility, so maybe not completely honest about how they're doing. And so I think it's safe to say generally student athletes are on par with their peers, maybe slightly less in some areas, but then these three areas, suicide, substance abuse, eating disorders, that's where we see higher rates. During the pandemic, across the board, increased stress, increased rates of depression, increased rates of anxiety. That is true for athletes as well. Post-COVID, some initial trends from the NCAA research are that overall students are feeling better, they're feeling more hopeful, but we're still not back to pre-pandemic levels of mental health concerns. So again, painting a picture here, we know there's a problem, we know there are concerns here, we know that we need to pay attention to this. I think in the public, there's a lot more communication and conversation around this kind of in pop culture and news, etc. Unfortunately, due to some high profile situations of student athlete suicides, and there's really been more of a call to the community to say, how do we serve our student athletes better? How do we understand student athlete wellness? How do we shift move the needle a little bit on this if we know there's such a complex issue here when we add that layer of athletics. So many of you on this webinar are probably thinking, well, I'm not trained in mental health. Like, I'm not a mental health professional. There may be a few, I know I've seen like a couple of former students who maybe are mental health professionals, so this conversation for you is a little bit different. But if you're on this training and you're a mom, or you're a professional in a different setting, or you're a dad or whatever, you may be thinking like, how do I really know? How do I know if there's a problem with my student athlete? How do I know that I need to do something more than I'm already doing? So let's talk a little bit about what are some things that we can look at. What can we be paying attention to see, and what are our next steps? So as Greg mentioned earlier, I'm a trained mental health therapist, worked with children for years. I've been a licensed counselor for years. And one of the things I found is I am trained to diagnose, right? I've had that training. But the reality is there's really 5 areas of functioning that we want to consider. So if a parent's bringing a kiddo into me for therapy, there are 5 areas that I really want to assess. Yes, I'm going to diagnose, but if I'm really trying to determine, is this child struggling? Are they functioning well enough, or is there what we would call their functioning impaired, meaning they're not able to participate at school, at home, or in the community as we expect them to be able to do? And so here's 5 areas that I want you to think about for your student athlete or for the young athletes that you're working with. The first area we're going to think about is changes in sleep. So this can be either way. It can be a student who suddenly is having a lot of trouble sleeping, and so they're getting very minimal sleep, their sleep's disturbed, they're complaining about being really tired. If you're in a classroom setting, this may be a student who's suddenly falling asleep repeatedly in class because they're not getting enough sleep at home. It can also be someone who sleeps too much. So we're really thinking about a change in sleep. So it used to be you slept 8 hours and now you sleep 12 hours and it still doesn't ever feel like enough. They're sleeping a lot during the day, difficulty getting up and kind of taking care of themselves. Either one of those changes. Now, as we're talking through all of these things, I do want to put a plug here for remembering kind of developmentally what we should expect of kids at different times. And so it's a little tricky sometimes to not pathologize normal behavior developmentally. And we don't have enough time today to dig into all these developmental levels and what to expect. But I can say, and those of you who've been around teenagers especially, or you parented teenagers, there are times when it seems like your teenager is just literally going to sleep all the time. And are they going to get them out of the room? It's 1 o'clock in the afternoon on a Saturday. Are they up? So some of this is normal, right? That they're going to have more sleep, or they stay up too late watching video games or playing video games, and then they're sleeping late in the morning, as they kind of establish their own structure. So it's not an automatic, any of one of these areas is not an automatic like, oh, my child's suddenly sleeping more, they may have a mental health issue. It's like, no, they could be tired. They could be not having, good habits at bedtime and staying up too late. They could be in a growth spurt. So we're looking at all of these pieces and kind of saying, is there enough of a change here to notice? So first area, changes in sleep. Sleeping too much, not sleeping enough. The next area is a noticeable difference in appetite and or weight. I think this is where this gets especially tricky for athletes, because there are seasons with athletes where they're maybe cutting, trying to cut down to a certain size for eligibility purposes, or they're in a heavy training season where they're doing paying a lot more attention to their nutrition and their training, and then other seasons where they're kind of maybe in an off season and they're not paying enough attention to that. And so what we're really looking for here is changes in appetite or noticeable changes in weight that can't be explained well, or a rationale is not apparent for them. Okay, so it's like suddenly child's never eating or adolescent's never eating, but there's not really a reason, medical reason, or specific or structured reason of why that's the case. Same for weight loss, or weight gain. So it is normal for all human beings to have fluctuations in their weight. That's a normal human experience. If you're an athlete and you have an off season and on season, there may be fluctuations in kind of your performance readiness and kind of how much training you're doing. All of that can be normal. But what we're looking for is like, hey, I've noticed maybe my athlete's actually increasing their training, but decreasing their eating in a way that it's a little too much of a gap. Maybe they're gaining a lot of weight and it's kind of confusing why, again, there's not an explanation. We're looking for changes in functioning. So not sleeping great, sleeping too much weight gain, too much weight loss. Same with appetite. So they may not be having significant changes in their weight up or down, but their appetite's not there. They're not eating regularly. Again, developmentally, thinking about it, all of us probably know teenagers that, we lovingly say they're garbage disposals and they'll eat everything you put in front of them. And then there's those that, won't eat anything. And so we're looking for those changes and trying to put together a picture of like, how is my student really doing overall? Third area, changes in academic performance, sports performance, or home performance. And so we're talking about students who, were making A's and B's and now they're making C's, D's, and F's. We're talking about students who were doing okay on the field and now seem to be struggling keeping up. Again, accounting for differences in ability. If someone's not an Olympic athlete, we can't say like, oh, they're not performing at Olympic level, therefore something must be wrong. Like, no, that's just maybe not their, their level. But we're looking for these changes. We're looking for the student was really here and performing on this trajectory, and now they're not. Especially you want to pay attention if there are changes in more than one of these areas. I think there's some reasonable explanations for why someone may struggle just academically, but not in the other areas. Sports performance and not in the other areas. Home conflict, not in the other areas. But when you're seeing changes in the student in two or more of these areas, that's a little flag of like, hey, there's something to look at here. Doesn't always mean there's a mental health concern, but that does warrant a closer look, a closer conversation about, what potentially could be going on here. The fourth area is withdrawal from family and peer relationships. And this is a tough one, y'all, because again, if you're working with teenagers right now, especially, you may be thinking, okay, well, my teenagers spent the last 3 years locked in their bedroom, not talking to us or whatever. But really looking for, I think especially when when teens begin to withdraw from their peers, they were hanging out, they were spending time with them, they were, playing video games together, whatever. And then it's like, I hadn't seen this person in a long time. I haven't heard them say anything about their friends. They're not wanting to go out on the weekends. So a change in that functioning. There's going to be some fluctuations. There's going to be times where you feel super connected to your kids and other times where it feels like, okay, we're really disconnected here. But we're really looking for that withdrawal, that sense of like, I was close to people and now I'm not close to people. I was engaged with my family, but I don't engage anymore. This can also sometimes not just be withdrawal, but increase in anger and irritability. One of the things we know about depression, especially in children and adolescents, is they may be more likely to present with irritability and frustration rather than just sadness. And so sometimes kids who are really struggling with depression, it first comes to our attention because they're just kind of fighting everybody. Everything sets them off. Everything, the littlest thing seems they have the official term is low frustration tolerance. So any little thing becomes a big thing really easily. Developmental, right? So we'll put that plug in here. Some of that, a little bit more emotionally volatile behavior, is really developmentally appropriate for teenagers. That's part of their brain development during that time. But we're still going to be paying attention. We're going to be looking across these 5 areas and saying, hey, I'm saying yes to this, yes to this, yes to this. So maybe it's just not normal teenage irritability. And then the last one is observable changes in mood, or the student really sharing that their mood has changed. And so here we're looking specifically at their emotional experience. Okay, so their level of sadness, their level of hopelessness. What you may see here sometimes too is a child, what we call their self-talk. And so how they're talking about themselves. I think back years and years ago, I worked with a young student athlete. He was about 9 years old and was on a travel ball team. And I lived at the time in an area where that was extremely competitive. And he was the youngest he was on a 10 and under team, but basically everybody was 10 and he had just turned 9. So he was younger. He had an older sibling who excelled, he was above average in his ability and played the same sport. A lot of pressure there. And so he would he would say how stressed he was, and then he would say these things that were just, the tone was pretty hopeless, right? So I'm never going to be good enough at this. A lot of perfectionism. Like, I feel like I have to be perfect. If I make a mistake, everybody on the team's going to be mad at me. He got so anxious that it was to the point where he would literally get physically sick every single game. And so when we're looking at this group, kind of painting this picture, even a child 8 or 9 years old, he was having nightmares at night, not necessarily about playing ball, because he loved ball. And he would even say, I don't want to quit. I love ball, but I don't enjoy it anymore. I don't know how to get back to enjoying it. And so he was struggling at night with nightmares. He didn't necessarily have changes in appetite or weight. He was a relatively small child for his age, but pretty much still on track with that. So not a huge area for him. Definitely changes in school performance, home performance, and sports performance. He was really struggling to play, had kind of gone down on his performance, was kind of at a level. He was good enough to kind of be on the team initially, but then began to perform poorly as the season went on. A lot of struggle with his peers, a lot of conflict with his brother that I was mentioning earlier. Definitely withdrawal from family. He got to where he would not talk to his family about games. He wouldn't talk after the games. He was spending a lot more time on his own in his room. And at 8 or 9 years old, maybe a little young for that. So thinking about developmental age, still not there. And then he was fidgeting. So that observable mood, he was fidgeting. He was talking about how worried he was. He would just obsess for days before the game. Okay, we're going to play on this day and at this time, and it's going to be in this town. And, I'm going to do this, and I've got to work on this. And he got almost obsessive about his practicing. So he'd be at home and wanting to practice a lot beyond what the normal practicing is. And I think sometimes it's easy to look at a kid like that and say, man, he's really dedicated. He's 9 years old and he's thinking about a training schedule. But if you heard what he was saying and kind of how he was talking to himself, it really was all based around this really, really intense fear of messing up, of doing something wrong. And so, from a clinical perspective, I recognize this child is experiencing anxiety, really diagnosable level anxiety. But it really manifested for him specifically around baseball, which he loved. He loved baseball. It wasn't a matter of even a recommendation of like, well, he just needs to quit baseball. No, he loves baseball, and there's some great benefits to baseball for him. But we have to be paying attention to how can we support him so that baseball doesn't become this part where he just, falls apart every single week when he's with his team. So again, if you're on this call, you may or may not be working in a clinical setting, probably won't be required to diagnose. But if I'm looking at my athlete, regardless of their age, so I think these rule applies even if you're working with adult athletes, are they reporting changes in sleep? Is there a change to their weight or their appetite? Changes in their performance on the field or anywhere else? Withdrawal or changes, negative changes in their relationships? And what's their actual mood? Like, what are we actually seeing here? And together, these 5 things can give you a clue as to, is there more to pursue here, or are we probably okay? Now, I mentioned this earlier. I'll say it again here. Not everyone, not every athlete that needs additional support is going to qualify for a diagnosis. So we're not just talking about the cases, that 10%, where it's like we really do need a professional. And we'll talk about how to know when you need to do that. But we're also talking about the other 90% of kids who may still be struggling with their stress, who may not, may still be, we call it subclinical. So they don't meet the criteria for diagnosis, but they're not necessarily okay all the way either. And so looking at all these areas as a parent, as a coach, as a teacher, whatever capacity you're in, and saying, does this child need extra support? Or is there at least a conversation we need to have now to figure out what kind of supports the person needs? So I mentioned this earlier. I'll mention it again. Anytime we're thinking about a person's behavior, their mood, their experiences, we always need to think about where they are on human development, from a human development standpoint. I joke sometimes, I'm actually teaching a class right now on diagnosis to our graduate students in counseling. And so I always talk about the importance of human development because, as a therapist, folks will come in and they'll bring their teenagers and they'll say, I think my teenager has bipolar disorder. And I will just say, you know what, I'm going to pause, because if you look developmentally, in some ways it feels like all teenagers can meet the criteria for bipolar disorder. And I don't say that to dismiss bipolar disorder. It's a real thing, but that emotional volatility, rapid changes in mood, some of those things can really be a hallmark of normal adolescent development. Okay. So if you're thinking about your teen student athlete and you're just already in this webinar, you're like, oh man, we are 20 minutes in, 25 minutes in, and I think I have a problem. Take a breath. You may have a problem, but you know what? You may not. This may be typical teenager stuff. And so if you have questions about development, that's another area. If you're on the fence and you're like, I don't really know what a teen should be doing or whatever, there are folks out there that can help with that. Your pediatrician can help with that. If your family works with a therapist, they can help with that. We need to be thinking about human development in the midst of all this, so we're not kind of misinterpreting folks' behavior about that. The other area to think about with this is brain development. And so I could probably do a whole webinar, 20 webinars talking about brain development, because that's an area that I really can nerd out about and I love it. But one of the things to keep in mind is that the front part of our brain is where our executive functioning happens. So that frontal cortex is where all of our executive functioning, so decision making, understanding consequences, all of those functions happen in that frontal cortex. That part of our brain is not fully developed until approximately 25 years of age. So if you have a kid, or you have a teenager, or you have a college student you're thinking about here, and they're making some really risky decisions that you don't understand, one of the things to keep in mind really here is they don't have that part of their brain is not completely developed yet. There'll be glimpses of it, especially older adolescents. Some of those synapses are firing, but that part of their brain is not completely put together and working at its top, performance until mid to late 20s. And so having an expectation that a teenage athlete is able to say, if I do this and this to my body, or I don't do this and this to my body, then here's the impact to my sports performance. they're not necessarily able to do that. Okay. So they may need some different supports there. It doesn't mean, oh, they have a mental health concern because they're doing these risky things. No, it's because they're teenagers and they're going to do the risky things. And so we need to make sure that they have support and encouragement in place to do that. So always be thinking about development. And if this feels confusing to you, find somebody who can help with this area. Find someone who has some expertise in development. If that's not you, that's okay. But find somebody, find some support, and find some resources. I always feel like it's better to err on the side of caution, that I would rather have a student kind of jump through the hoops to be evaluated for mental health concerns, et cetera, by a professional, and it be a non-event. There's not anything really there to address, than for the opposite to happen. And we assume like this is probably just normal, and then they don't get the help that they need. So, it's not harmful to get support. It's not harmful to get support in most cases. Okay, so we've talked about kind of the statistics of what's out there. We've talked about some things that our student athletes may be experiencing in addition to like normal childhood things. We've talked some about those 5 areas of functioning, kind of looking at if there are changes in these areas, is it indicating a problem? So we've covered all that. I've walked through all that with my own student. Okay, here I am. I am concerned about my athlete. I've seen enough. There's enough change in those 5 areas. What do I do now? And this is the point where there can be a lot of anxiety. What do we do now? I think we put a lot of pressure on ourselves as parents, as coaches, et cetera, that we're scared we're going to say the wrong things and make things worse. And my encouragement to you here is that, yes, there are some not super effective steps you can take here, like ignoring their needs, brushing it under the rug. But seeking out and getting help, generally speaking, is not going to make things worse. You caring for your athlete and trying to understand what their experience is not going to make it worse. So there's some really practical things that you can do here to offer support for your students, for your athletes. And then, a lot of it is holding their hand and getting them to the place where someone who's more trained, who's licensed, a licensed therapist, et cetera, can really help and fill in those gaps for the true services that they need. So what do we do? So first step is engage in conversation. Okay. So a lot of what we were talking about earlier, as far as how do I know if there's a problem, is really geared around towards our observation, right? We're listening, we're observing, we're taking into account what we already know about a student, about an athlete and their functioning. So I've observed and I've done this, and there's enough here that I think, hey, there's a problem. So the next step is to talk to the kid themselves. This is a place I think where folks get super anxious because unless you're a therapist, unless you're in a social worker, unless you're in maybe a teacher, you're not always trained in how to navigate a conversation like this. I think we're getting better as a society about talking about mental health, about talking about emotional well-being, about thinking about how we communicate with each other, but we're not quite there yet. And some of us come from families that never talked about this, that this was, there's still a lot of stigma with mental health. So there's a lot of folks out there, in my generation and the generation before me, et cetera, that this was something that you did not talk about as a family at all. Maybe didn't even use feeling words. I have friends that, I feel lucky if based on my field that I came from a family that used feeling words. So I didn't have to learn those words. Right. But I have friends who are literally have zero memories whatsoever using feeling words in their home. And that's okay. We can grow from that. But the best thing we can do for our student athletes when they're really struggling is to engage them in conversation. So what might that conversation look like? So here's where we want to plug in just our basic active listening skills. Okay. So when we're thinking about active listening skills, we're thinking about how do I listen to understand instead of listening to respond. And what I mean by that is often in conversations, we are taking information in from the other person in order to, and simultaneously thinking about what we're about to say, right? So, if we're in a meeting and we're at work and we're like, oh, this person's giving their explanation of whatever. I'm over here formulating what I'm going to say, right? Because I'm going to have a response to this person. This is especially true if you're mad, right? We're like, I don't really, not that we don't care what the other person's saying, but maybe there's part of us that doesn't because we're just trying to respond. But we're thinking about engaging with our student athletes where there's a concern. Our ear needs to be tuned toward what do I need to hear here? And so there's some really basic skills that we can do here. One is what we call paraphrasing. So that's being able to just kind of summarize what the person said back to them to check for understanding. So we'll want to engage in a conversation like this starting with an open question. So an open question is a question that isn't necessarily a yes or no answer. We also call them door openers if it's not a question. So an example, you may say, hey, student, I've noticed some changes in how you've been sleeping and it seems like how you've been feeling. So I'm just wondering what's been going on. General, very open question, like, is there something up? It uses some observable things like I've noticed changes in your sleep and your whatever, observable things, but I'm leaving the door open to not make assumptions about what's been going on. Now, some folks are just going to be like, nothing, I'm fine, right? And they may respond that way. And then a lot of students may surprise you and they may say, yeah, I'm having a hard time. So we're going to start with an open question, not an assumption. I think one of our tendencies here is that we feel anxious. And so we say too much. We may be like, well, I was watching this webinar the other day about student athlete mental health. And they said, if this, and this happened, I'm worried about this. Or they lead with a performance. That's one caution I will give you here is I encourage you to not enter these conversations with student athletes based solely on sports performance. Because that can really increase their stress. But so having that open question of like, hey, I'm concerned about you. I want to check in. It seems like you're struggling some. Let's have a conversation. So that's how you open the door. The next is that paraphrasing that I mentioned before. So that's summarizing. A brief summary. Again, not saying too much. Very to the point. Like, okay, it sounds like you really have a lot on your plate between school and football or school and basketball or whatever it is. Or you're really feeling the impact of the changes at home. Okay, so just a reflection or a paraphrase of what they're saying. Another skill you can use is a reflection of their feeling. And so just saying back to them, like, you're really stressed, or it sounds like you're really overwhelmed. And so what that does for them is it just validates and says, like, I hear you and I understand what you're saying. Because most students are going to be like, oh, this is so fun. I love talking to my coach or my mom or whatever about my mental health struggles. Woohoo, I've been looking forward to this. They're not going to necessarily feel that way, right? So what I need to create as the adult in that conversation is that this is a place where we're going to talk openly. This is a place where I'm not going to judge you, or I'm not here to get onto you or to punish you because of what I'm seeing. This is a place where I just want to understand what is happening. And so you leave the door kind of open question, paraphrase what they're saying, reflect their feeling, help them, you make sure you understand how they feel, and then follow-up questions at times, thinking about like, how long have you been feeling this way? What do you think might help with this? Is there something we can take off your plate? So there's a lot of follow-up questions you can, again, engage in a conversation around where is the athlete right now and what do they need. One note here, if you're working with younger children, so if you're here and you're working with elementary school age kids, elementary school age and preschool age is a great place to lay the foundation for these kind of conversations moving forward. So getting kids in the habit of being able to identify their emotions and talk about when they're struggling. There's loads of children's books out there that talk about emotions. There's Sesame Street, clips and Bluey clips that talk about how people are feeling. And so if you're like, well, I don't really have a teenager yet, we're not really ready for that conversation. My kiddo's 4, my kiddo's 6, whatever. I encourage you now to be thinking about not just if he's an athlete, but all of your kiddos learning how to talk about how they feel and setting up an environment that you as a parent or you as a coach or you as a teacher are open. We want to have these kinds of conversations. So conversation, first response, conversation, building relationship, offering support, getting more information. So the next stage of that is bringing in experts or professionals. So this is going to vary depending on what your student may need. This may be contacting a licensed therapist. It may be talking to their pediatrician. If you work in a school setting, either a K-12 school or higher ed, this may mean, connecting to some other professionals in your organization, checking in if you're in a college setting, checking in with the athletic trainer, checking in with the academic advisor, just kind of saying like, hey, I want to check in on this student. Does this student have needs? Do we need to connect them to resources? At school, it may be checking in with their teacher to see how things are going if you don't already know, checking in with their school counselor if there's a relationship there, or their coach. I will say here, one of the things I always remind adults to do here is this is really a need to know basis. So this is not a situation, if you have a conversation with your athlete and then you turn around and share what they have said with everybody around them, that's not going to go well. And likely what it will create is a situation where the athlete won't want to talk to you again. However, what you can do is check in and say, hey, I just want to check in on so-and-so. Do you have concerns? Has everything been going okay? And get information from the other adults around the student, because that will also help you make an informed decision about what needs to happen. So bringing in experts, bringing in professionals, pediatrician, licensed therapist, social work, clinical social worker, etc., are all folks that we can bring around our students to provide extra support. And then the last step here is, I call it know when to level up. And so the vast majority of our students, when we bring in extra, a therapist, talks to their pediatrician, provide some extra supports at home and at school, that's probably going to be enough to address their needs. A lot of times, especially in childhood and adolescence, when students experience mental health needs, they can be transient, meaning they happen for a period of time and then they usually go into remission or some type of a higher level of functioning, at least for a while. So what we need to keep an eye on here is that smaller percentage of students that may be experiencing things like suicidal thoughts, severe substance abuse, things like that. And so knowing when to level up and say, hey, just having the conversation, just talking to a few other professionals maybe isn't enough. We need some more immediate care. So how do we know when we need to do that? And so here I want to talk about suicide. And suicide can be a very difficult topic to talk about, especially when we're thinking about children and adolescents. I say this not to shock you, but just to give some context. I have worked with children as young as 6 years old who have attempted to harm themselves. So if you're sitting here thinking like, my kid's too young or my athletes are too young, it is a lot less likely that younger children will have suicidal thoughts or suicidal self-harm behaviors, but it's not impossible. It can happen. And so if there's a concern there in these conversations, ask questions, okay? I think sometimes we worry that if I ask a question or if I talk about suicide openly or if I ask about a child's self-harm and they don't feel suicidal, I'm going to put the thought in their mind. That is not true. That is completely a myth. What we find is actually the opposite, that the best way to provide support and care for a child is to ask them explicitly. If we don't do that, it is less likely that the person's going to disclose that they need help. So you're going to listen and observe for cues. So we're looking for things where a student may be showing extremely reckless behavior. They may be harming themselves. They may actually be saying it. The other thing you can sometimes see is folks sometimes, not everyone, sometimes when they're contemplating suicide, will do what we call kind of getting their affairs in order. They may give things away. They may quit events. They may do things like that to kind of prepare themselves or clean up some of their loose ends, I guess you would say. So looking for those cues, looking to, see, are they saying things about, I wish I could just not wake up tomorrow. Nobody would miss me if I was gone, statements like that. So then ask questions. And I have listed some questions here. You can use these exact questions. And you may look at these and think, whoa, that's pretty blunt. I can't imagine looking at my 12-year-old and asking these questions, but these are questions that are okay to ask. and are important to ask. So point blank asking, are you having thoughts of hurting yourself or killing yourself? Now, I'm going to put a little note here. Kids can be hurting themselves, like cutting, and it's not suicidal. So there's kind of a separate experience where students that children, adolescents, and adults really can have, where they're hurting themselves and cutting themselves, but it's not suicide. Here we're trying to figure it out, right? So are you having thoughts of hurting yourself or killing yourself? Are they answering yes or no? Do you have a plan to hurt yourself? Is there a timeline for that plan? So again, asking specifically. Sometimes what kids will say is they're like, well, I just think if I didn't wake up, that would be easier. And it's like, okay, that counts as a suicidal ideation, but it doesn't, but they're like, well, I don't have a plan, or I'm not going to do anything, or I don't have any ideas. Okay, so there's maybe not an immediate threat, but we want to get this kid some help. If a kid feels like, it'd be easier if I didn't wake up, that's a clue for me. That's, as a grown-up, it's like, okay, this is something I need to pay attention for. This is something to level up. So do you have thoughts of doing it? Do you have a plan? And is there a timeline for that plan? And do you want to actually kill yourself? And have you taken any steps? Straightforward questions. We're looking for specific answers. If your student is saying yes to all three of these areas, then you need immediate action. That's the big level up. That's go to an emergency room. That's call 911. If they're maybe saying yes to the first one but no to the other ones, that's still a bit of a level up. They may not be in imminent danger, but we want to make sure that they're plugging in and getting evaluated by a therapist, that we have some other professionals on hand here. But ask the questions. Get help quickly if the answer is yes. You can call a national suicide hotline. There's a way to text that suicide hotline. If you just Google National Crisis Line, all the information will be there. There's an additional resource here in Birmingham through the Children's Hospital Perk Line. It's a psychiatric intake response unit. And so you can actually call a general number and they will help you find services in the area. It's specifically geared towards children and adolescents. Provide ongoing support and monitoring. So especially if you're a parent, you'll have part in the safety plan, figuring out, are they getting worse? Are they getting better? Do they have, good supports in place? Are they getting the professional help that they need? And here's another place that's inform key player adults as needed. So this is not something to share across things. We live in the world of social media, and sometimes I'm very surprised by the things people put on social media. This is not a social media share, but if there's concerns about a student's safety, we do need to make sure that the adults around them are watching out for their safety. The other thing that you can see here, in addition to suicide, is that there are a couple of other things like a severe eating disorder or significant substance abuse issues that may also require a level up. So if you are, let's talk about eating disorders first. So if you're noticing that, changes in weight, changes in behavior, concerns about binging and purging, over-exercise, etc., if your athlete is female and they stop menstruating, all of those are signs of pretty significant eating disorder, and the child needs not only mental health support, but medical support as well. So leveling up for those kids means making sure they're getting medically cleared and checked, because there can be a lot of physical complications, medical complications for eating disorders, along with that mental health. If you're thinking about substance use and substance abuse, and so you're asking some questions about how much they're using, you catch them with substances, a lot of those 5 areas of functioning will change with substance use. Then leveling up again also includes making sure you're reaching out to professionals that can do the substance abuse support, and that may include things like drug testing, etc. So a lot of kids are going to fall. I'm going to go back. A lot of kids are going to fall in that kind of first round of bringing professionals in. We're going to connect with a therapist as an individual, as a family. We're going to connect with folks at school. We're going to have some additional support in place. But when we're thinking about suicide, when we're thinking about substance abuse, when we're thinking about eating disorders, we're probably going to level up even from there. And that's when we're going to start to involve hospitals, 911, medical doctors, substance abuse treatment. Okay, so some encouraging news, and then I'm going to halt and answer any questions that you may have. There are some positive trends recently. So even though it feels kind of bleak, I always get to an end of presentation like this and I say, this is not a fun presentation, right? This is an important topic, but it's hard to hear. But some good news is that more recent student athlete research does indicate that the statistical trends are positive. We are moving in a better direction for a lot of student athletes. Some other good news is that many of the mental health concerns we talked about today, and the ones that are more prevalent, like depression, anxiety, OCD, ADHD, are very responsive to psychotherapy treatment and psychopharmacological treatment. And so there are medications that help and treatment modalities that help and make a big difference. Like we have people who go into what we would call remission of a lot of these when they get the services that they need. The other thing that we know is that family and community support goes a long way for helping children and adolescents have more positive health and mental health outcomes long term. So the fact that you're in this webinar and be thinking about, hey, I want to make sure that my athletes are well all around, not just performing well on the field, that gives your athletes an advantage, whether they're your own children or someone you're coaching or someone you're seeing in a different setting. Having that family and community support, in addition to the professional support, does increase and cause more positive outcomes long term. So as hard as the conversations are, as difficult as it can be to think about a child that you love or watching an athlete that you support and you encourage to really, really struggle, there are things we can do. There's some practical things you can do to have a conversation, bring in professionals, level up where you need to be, and then just be there. Be in relationship with these kiddos, encourage them, support them, help them connect to what they need, and we can get our athletes through these hard times. So, are there questions? We've got, it looks like 5, 6, 7 minutes. I don't see any questions in the chat. I don't know if there are any more in there.
Yeah, no, and with our audience, if you have a question, go ahead and drop it in the chat. So of the 5 areas, just rewinding all the way to the top of the presentation, of the 5 areas to consider, sleep, weight, all of that, is there one that's really more important than the others, or are these just things to really keep on top of?
Yeah, I think that I think if I was going to prioritize one as like first among them, it would be observable changes in mood and what the child actually expresses for their mood. Because that's going to give you some hints about, could these changes in the other areas be explained in another way? What we're really looking, all 5 of them though are really important because all 5 areas give us a picture of what we would call the child's functioning.
Okay.
So you can struggle in any of these 1 areas and it be not necessarily an impact to your overall functioning. Like we probably all had times where we had insomnia and it's like, I'm on the struggle bus, but it was 4 days without sleeping, or it was 3 days without sleeping, but I'm not necessarily in a mental health crisis. But all 5 of these put together will hopefully give us a better idea of like, hey, is this a time we need to level up? That there's more that needs to happen here. But listen to kids and what they're saying about how they feel and how they're thinking about their mood, their health, etc. Listen to them, look at that first, and then look at these other areas.
The first slide you had about the CDC saying things about the children, ADHD, anxiety, depression. Do you know what year those were pulled from?
So those were composite things, they're pre-pandemic, so 2011 through 2019. And then the research that happened after that, there's like a COVID era where everything was higher, and we're still in the post-COVID area figuring out what the trends are now. So those initial slides were pre-COVID.
Okay. How do you engage in communication with preteens who are not showing signs but are in a competitive area that could potentially cause negative body image?
Oh, so that's a really complicated area here, I think. I think one of those things, I think there's a lot we can do as families overall, and as coaches, as grown-ups around kids overall, when it comes to body image. There's a lot of language we use, like good and bad foods, etc., that really can cause harm over time. And so I think shifting our language around thinking about how foods fuel our body, thinking about the strength of our body, thinking about what it is that we want our body to do and what we need to do in order to help our body do that can be better conversations versus some of the language around good and bad and healthy and unhealthy. And then again, some overt questions. I mean, I think some of this is really engaging openly in questions about how they feel about their body. Like, are they concerned about their weight? What do they think about, you know, what their peers are looking at and the images that they see on their screens? And so there's a lot of really good resources out there about talking about food and nutrition and exercise in a more neutral term. And so those resources can be really helpful. There's a lot out there about that, using more like body neutral, food neutral language. And so that's where I would start with young children and preteens who haven't already expressed a problem in this area.
Gotcha. Do you have any pointers on how to find the appropriate therapist or counselor for a child and what they're dealing with specifically?
Yeah, so thankfully in the technology age, you can find a lot of information about what therapists can treat on the internet. So I always encourage people, if they're seeking therapy, if they're going to use their insurance, use your insurance database first. So you'll have a provider list, and then that will help narrow it down. There's also research. Psychology Today does like these profiles of therapists. And so you can actually Google and filter through people who work specifically with children, folks who have experience with anxiety, that type of things. And so that really, a lot of it is about figuring out, one, the practicality of like, if I need to use insurance, who will my insurance pay? But most therapists are going to have a listing of the specialty of the area of like what ages they work with. The other thing people I think don't always know is that you can shop for a therapist. Like, you can go one time, and if it doesn't seem like a good fit, go to somebody else. So take some time if you need to find the right person. That's always my encouragement, is that just shop. Read what they have online, ask them questions up front about what their specialty is, and if it's not a good fit the first time, find somebody else.
And the final question before we let you go, should we ask if there's a particular event that occurred that is causing mental health issues, like if they're being bullied without an athlete shutting down?
Yeah, so I think that's good. I think when you starting the conversation more open to just say, hey, I've noticed you're struggling, and opening the door for them to talk. And then asking a more open question of like, is there something going on, or has something happened that contributes to this? Like, has something happened at school? And I think depending on the age of the child, that conversation may look different. So a little kid, you may be like, hey, are things okay in your class? Are things okay with your friends? Kind of some more specific conversation. And then with adolescents and older folks, older students, we may just say like, hey, is there some, more general, like, I'm wondering if there's something going on with school, that's leading to this. So yes, you can ask, but start the conversation a little bit more open, and then use that as an opportunity to follow up about a specific event.
Awesome. It's such a great topic. It's also a difficult topic to approach. And Dr. Watson, we appreciate you spending the last hour with us and giving this presentation and kind of giving us tips of what to watch for and what to do. So thanks so much for being with us.
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity to be here.
You're so very welcome. And just a quick reminder, recording of today's webinar will be available on our website by tomorrow. As an attendee, you'll be receiving an email once the replay link is ready. Before we go, we have a few events to pass along to you, and we'd love to see you at. Are you ready for football? Join us before every home game at Protective Stadium for our alumni tailgate. We'll be on the rooftop of Uptown Cantina starting at 2.5 hours before kickoff, including tomorrow night's game against North Carolina A&T. Each pass is only $20 and includes food, a drink ticket, live entertainment, and plenty more. Purchase your passes at alumni.uab.edu/events. And check out these upcoming webinars on Wednesday, September 13th. Come back for Precision Medicine, Chat GPT, and AI, History and Trends. Dr. Jake Chin will be with us as we explore this emerging technology and what it means for us. On Tuesday, September 19th, we'll be hosting Strategizing for Sustainability. Nick Ciancio will join us as we explore what it means, what UAB is doing, and how you can play your part. On Tuesday, September 26th, return for Can We Starve Ourselves to Better Health and Longer Lives? Dr. Stephen Ossed will be here to share what we learned about the impact of food restriction on human health. And on Tuesday, October 10th, learn where we'll be going for upcoming alumni travel destinations through Colette Travel. Jack Brinson will share highlights for journeys to Ireland, France, Canada, and Central Europe. Register for these and many more at alumni.uab.edu/events. events. Finally, let us know how we're doing. What'd you like? What would you like to see in the future? Your comments are always helpful as we continue to provide virtual opportunities for our alumni and friends. Once again, thank you so much for joining us for this afternoon's webinar. And as always, go Blazers.